Welcome to night 4 of our web API sprint. So we're going to round the sprint off with the topic of deployment. So who here can tell me what deployment is? Hosting it on the web, publishing it, yeah, exactly. So it's the difference between I've spun up a server on my local machine that I can use on my local machine versus I've actually deployed something to the web, which means everyone can access it or everyone who has permission. So this means that there's lots of opportunity in the near future for some good old-fashioned trolling fun, because we're all going to be deploying tonight's guided project to the web, which means that not only can we post to our own APIs, we can post to each other's APIs. So be civil, but maybe not too civil. So we will be working on that. The two things you need for tonight are, of course, the guided project, which I will post in Slack right now in case you don't have it forked and cloned and everything installed. And then as everyone should have informed you, you also need a Heroku account. So we will be working with a deployment tool called Heroku. If you, for some reason, have not created an account yet, please do that right now. So our goal is pretty simple. We're going to take a look at a very simple server that's already been created for us, and then we have to start thinking like Heroku. So we're going to have to go through and make some changes to get it ready for deployment, and then we will actually deploy. So not too bad of a night. And I will give a little disclaimer to you guys, which working with Heroku is really easy, but it's one of those things where you just have to know what the steps are. So things are outlined on Training Kit. Definitely pay attention, and we'll get the video up as soon as we can after the lecture, because Heroku is pretty easy to use, but if you get stuck on something because you just forgot one little step, it can sometimes be very frustrating to debug. So it's not a long lecture, but pay close attention is I think what I'm trying to say. Well, let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll jump on in on the guided project and start to see what's going on there. All right. So in this guided project, we have a simple server set up. So we, of course, have our index.js where our listening is happening. We have server.js where we have these two endpoints defined. So instead of full CRUD operations, we're just working with two endpoints here. A get all for shoutouts and a post. So pretty simple stuff. Helmet's being used. We're using express.json. This is actually a really simple bit of code that we have given you out of the gate. But as I mentioned, our job here is to go through and think about how Heroku is going to view our code base. So I'm going to ask a pretty open-ended question here, which is, what does Heroku need to know? And I would encourage, if you've used Heroku before, don't answer this. I want people who have never deployed before to start to think about this. If you've used Heroku before and know how it works, I ask you to be silent. Keep your knowledge to yourself. But for those of you who are going to be deploying for the first time, let's start to think about, what would Heroku need to know? And it's not immediately obvious, so this might take some thinking. What might Heroku need to know in order to deploy this? Did you all already use it for Build Week? Darn it. Just kidding. Well, then everyone can answer. Or the one person who didn't can answer. Routes. So I see that one person answered, where is your index.js? You summed it up, the entry point. So every server has one entry point. And absolutely, Heroku needs to know where the entry point to the server is. So yeah, that's exactly right. So that's the first thing we need to do. So let's kind of reverse engineer this. how do we know the entry? When we're just doing this locally, when we're just running spinning up our servers on localhost, how do we know where our entry point is? Or how do we tell Node where our entry point is? Or to start, what is? It's always been index.js. Yep, and that's very standard, is index.js. But think about when we in the package.json. So it turns out that even though index.js is a nice standard, the only reason that matters is because it's in here. We have a server script that actually says run nodemon on index.js. So this is one of those things that it's obvious, but it's actually not. I really actually love tonight's lecture because it allows us to look at the things that we sort of take for granted, such as how does our app know where the entry point is? The true reason it knows is because it's actually hard-coded into package.json under the server script. So when I run npm run server, it knows to start our app from index.js. And let's go ahead. Always a good step before deploying is make sure it works locally. So let's go ahead and just hit localhost 4000. Uh-oh, we've got a problem. Uh-oh. Oh, I did a post. Thank you, guys. I was like, oh no, what went wrong? All right. There we go. So we're actually starting with a default empty database. So we just get back an empty array, which is not that exciting. But this tells us what we expect to see. If we've successfully deployed, we know that our starting point is going to be an empty array. And thank you guys for catching that request type. All right. So that is working. So now there's this question of, we know locally how we indicate our starting point, our entry point, but how do we do it in Heroku? Well, Heroku is its default setting is to start your server using a start script. So we need a start script that is going to run our server. So what should our start script look like? I'm opening up to you guys. We need some sort of start script in here. And what command should that script actually run? Node index.js. Why node instead of nodemon? Nodemon is designed for the terminal, but I want to go a little deeper than that. Because in production, we aren't using development mode, also true. But I still feel like we haven't gotten to the heart of the issue. It's not expecting it. We don't want to keep restarting the server. So think about what nodemon is designed to do. On the very first day, we actually started with running with node, which works, but it's extremely annoying because every time we make a change, we have to kill it, save it, restart it. So node is really the script we use to run a node file, but nodemon was this development substitute that we plugged in because it's really useful because it auto restarts when we're saving. And in fact, we add nodemon as a dev dependency, which is to say we're only expecting to use it in dev mode. So we really want to stick with node because that's actually the command that's designed to run a node file. It's just that nodemon is a nice substitute when we're in dev mode. So this is going to be the first step. Whenever you're going to be deploying with Heroku, you always want to define a start script that runs your entry point file using node. So there you go, step one. And let's make sure that script works. So if we run npm run start, now keep in mind this won't auto restart like nodemon, but this should work. And that's working locally as well. Awesome. All right, so I asked this kind of open-ended question of what does Heroku need to know? What information does Heroku need from us? And you guys are absolutely right that the entry point is a good starting place. What other information might Heroku need from us? Though actually in this case, in the case of the thing I'm thinking of, though I'm always open to interesting new answers, it's more information we need from Heroku. Information about database. That is a good point. So if we are working with, so dependencies, our package.json is going to go up and dependencies will all be installed by Heroku. So there's nothing extra we need to do. It will install all of these dependencies for us. So someone brought up database, and that's actually a really good point. Because if we're working with a more sophisticated database, something like Postgres or MySQL, there's extra configuration steps. Because without getting into the nitty-gritty too much, actually, we're going to pause and talk about databases for just a second. So we are using something called SQLite, and don't worry about this too much. We're going to cover it in detail next week. But all that means is this file is literally our database. Shouts.db3, our entire database is in that file. That file is in our repo. And so that file is going to go up with our repo. So essentially what I'm trying to say, somewhat clumsily, is that because we're using a simple database that's just a file, we actually don't have to do any extra configuration. If we were using a more advanced type of database, extra steps would be necessary, but we won't have to worry about that for tonight. Yes, I see the answer I was looking for, a port. So let's talk about ports for a little bit. Once again, we get to take this thing that we were kind of introduced to at the beginning of last week and take a second deeper look at it. So as a refresher, what is the purpose of the port? We know we're running on localhost 4000, but what does that 4000 even mean? It's a doorway. I like that, but I want something maybe a little deeper and more specific. Where the server lives. Also accurate. It's the window to your computer. Not quite. So the window to my computer would actually be my IP address. So the address of the entire computer is an IP address, which localhost serves as a substitute for the IP address. The port is the location on the computer because computers can run, CPUs can do lots of things. So the ports are kind of these individual places where different processes can run. So in short, we need two addresses in order to know where our server is. We need an IP and we need a port. When we're working in the localhost world, localhost serves as a substitute for our IP, and we can just kind of choose whatever old port we want as long as it's over 3000 and hard code it in. Yep, this idea of the apartment number in the complex. Our IP address is like the building number and our port is like the apartment number. So I'm going to write some notes here. So when running locally, the IP is taken care of by localhost, and we can hard code any old port over 3000 in. When deploying, it's a little different. So keep in mind, our server is not going to be living on our machine anymore. There's some CPU in some warehouse somewhere where our server will live. So Heroku will assign an IP address based on some random CPU somewhere. So Heroku will assign that IP address for us. But we can't just hard code in a port. Does anyone want to venture a guess about why we can't hard code in the port number anymore? Why we would be in trouble why Heroku doesn't even really allow us to do that? It may be in use, exactly. So these CPUs that are designed for things like deployment, they're being maximally used. So whereas your computer, there's a bunch of empty space because it's a personal computer, these CPUs are designed for hosting. So the port may be in use. So essentially, Heroku needs to tell us what port we're using because it has to pick one that's not in use. There isn't a bunch of free space for us to just come in and choose. So yeah, all the good ports would be taken. You know, that's really the hope when you deploy, is that you get a good one. No, they're all the same. But so instead, Heroku needs to tell us which port because it might be taken if we tried to hard code it in. So that's kind of the theory behind it, the reason. Now there's the practical question of how does Heroku tell us? And we're going to have to put that question aside for just a minute and talk about something called environment variables. Exactly, it's going to assign a variable to us. But instead of assigning, it assigns a specific type of variable called an environment variable. So it turns out that in Node, there is an object called process.env. This is a built-in object that's designed to hold environment variables. And environment variables are essentially variables that transcend a specific file. So normally we're used to declaring a variable in a file, and it's only available in that file, and sure, we can export and share things. But process.env is kind of like this master list of variables that can be shared across an entire repository. So this is where we will find our port. But before we really go into the port thing, let's just talk a little bit more about this thing. So I'm going to restart with npm run server so that we can see updates. And I've just console.logged this process.env thing. So let's see what we get. So look at this. It turns out that there's actually all of these mostly configuration related variables that are all stored on process.env. So there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that you don't actually need to know about. The big takeaway here is that there's something in all Node applications called process.env, and it's designed to store something called environment variables, essentially variables that should be shared across the entire repository. So what Heroku is going to do is it's going to assign a variable called port, all capitalized. And we could go into the Heroku settings and change that, but I think that's a pretty descriptive name. So what we know now is that process.env is, wait a minute, actually. Let me make sure, yeah, it is capitalized. Okay, so process.env.capital port. So this is just Heroku is set up to say this is the place we will put the port we want to use. And then we generally want to set a default, so we can stick with 4000 as our default. So now we know that port, this variable port, is going to be set to either an environment variable called port that Heroku will assign, or if that's undefined, 4000. So let me give you guys a minute to catch up on that and ask any questions about what we've talked about so far. What happens if it defaults to 4000 and 4000 is taken? So if we're deploying, this will be defined. We can feel assured. This is one of the guarantees that Heroku gives us, is that it's going to define this thing. So once we're deploying, it will never default to 4000 because this is guaranteed to be defined. So the only scenario it defaults to this is when we're running it locally. Do we still need the string escapes if we're switching to template literals? I'm assuming you're talking about this thing. So are you talking about the /n specifically? So /n just means new line. So you see how there's a gap above and below this? If I just did an n without the escaping, it would literally say n server running on localhost with an n. So the difference between /n and n is the difference between a literal n and a new line. So yeah. On that note though, we should update this. Not that we can see it in the Heroku log, but first of all, it's not guaranteed to run on localhost, so we should probably update this to running on port. Let's capitalize that. So that's more accurate because it will actually dynamically change what's logged in Heroku's log when we deploy. Any other questions? All right, so before we jump into Heroku and actually do some deploying, I want to spend a little bit more time with this environment variable thing, because once we get into database land, we're going to need to use more of this. And once we get into testing, we're going to need to use more of this. So since we're kind of introducing this idea of environment variables in Node, I want to spend a little more time just generally talking about it. And specifically talking about what if we ourselves wanted to define some environment variables. You might think, well, couldn't I just do something like process.env equals .port and define something on it? Well, yes, you can go into a file and actually hard code in an environment variable like this if you want. But first of all, that's a really, there's so many things wrong with that. And the most immediate one we could talk about is that if we deployed, we just hard code in and overwrite the variable. So we want to be able to potentially define some environment variables locally in dev while feeling certain that they're not going to overwrite what's being defined in production. And it turns out that there's a very specific way to do this. And it's going to require a library called .env. So let me go ahead and add that. So npm install dot spelled out env. So this is a library that's going to allow us to configure some environment variables locally in the development mode. Right. So what this does is it lets us create a .env file where we actually set up our environment variables. So I'm going to, just create a .env file in the root. And notice that there's even a special symbol for this file. So this is an expected thing. So this file is designed to set up all our environment variables. So if we wanted to set up a port variable for development, we could set it up in here. This is also a common place to keep secret things. And we'll, in the authentication section, see what kind of secret things we might want. But if there's some sort of secret code that we used, for example, to encrypt passwords, we'd put it in here. And I see someone has already mentioned that this file should be in your get ignore. So that's absolutely right. You want, because this is a dev-specific thing, you want this ignored. And it should already be ignored. Yep, there it is. So if you use a pre-generated get ignore, it often comes up in here already, but you should always make sure it's in here. For that reason, I mean, there's a couple reasons. If you have secret codes in here, yeah, you definitely don't want this ever going up to GitHub. Another reason is that if we deployed it and the port were in here, it would just default to this. So this port we're assigning will only work in development because the file won't even go up when we send it to be deployed. I still don't know what's up with the vulnerability thing. I need to spend some time figuring that out because I've tried fixing it. Package is out of date. Yeah, that might be it. Yep, should work. All right, so let me try this. Yeah, I think what I need to do is audit fix these and then push them back up to the master repository so we stop having this problem, which is probably something for me to do this weekend. But okay, so back to this file. So this is where we define all of our environment variables. And within the database world, we often want to define database environments within authentication, as you'll see in a couple sprints. We often need some sort of secret keys in order to get our auth to work correctly. But for now, we're just worried about port. So what is going to happen if I kill my server and restart it? What will the port be set to? We have some votes for 5,000, some votes for 4. This is kind of a tricky question. So we would hope it's 5,000, right? Because we'd hope that the port is defined now to the thing from .env. It turns out that it actually won't be because there's one more step we need to do. In order to get .env to work, in order to actually get the stuff in here to be put on process.env, we need to do one more thing. So require .env .config. So this is our final step. And we actually do have to kill our server and restart it. Because .env is ignored, it won't auto-detect changes with Nodem on. So if we restart it, now it works because we have this bit of code. A little note about this thing, this should always be, if you're using a .env file, this should be the first line of code at the top of your entry point. This should be the first thing you do so that you can guarantee that these variables will be defined for the entire application. So if you have this library installed, it configured at the top of your entry points, and your env file is set up, you can restart your server, and you should see that it's now defaulting to, or it's now using port 5,000. We're not using this default value because this port variable is actually defined in development as well. But when we deploy, this file won't come along for the ride, and we'll be able to use the port that Heroku provides. So let me give you guys a second to catch up on that, and if you have any questions, let me know. This question, yeah, what is .config? Someone already answered it in Slack, but I'll answer it here. So this library has a config method, and what it does is it takes any variables inside of .env and it puts them on the process.env object. Do we have to do something to stop .env to, what do we have to do to stop this file from getting sent to Heroku? As long as it's in get ignore, that'll be fine, because we'll actually be using git to push this up to Heroku. All right, so I have a question for you guys, which actually I'll put a poll up. So tonight's lecture is a little shorter than some of the other ones. So we have the choice of taking our break early. We also have the choice of just powering through so that you guys, usually depending on how many questions you have, this one runs a little over an hour, maybe an hour and a half. So we can either choose to skip our break and just go through, or I might actually vote we take our break now, which I know is really early. But let me put out a poll so you guys can tell me what you think. All right, just sent that out. What's in the env file? Specifically, it's going to be these sets of variables set equal to values in a stack like this, but we only have one defined, which is port equals 5000. Yes, in the more general sense, this is where you keep all your dark secrets. All right, we almost have a tie on the vote. Anyone who hasn't voted, vote. We need tiebreakers. All right, skip is running ahead. So I think we're gonna go with, actually, can we talk more about the get ignore? Yeah, that's actually a good, let's do that. So let's take a minute to talk about the get ignore. So the short answer of what is the get ignore is it's the things we don't want pushed to GitHub. But there's a deeper question here of what kind of things don't we want pushed to GitHub and why? Well, anything that's related to configuration or secret is kind of the two answers. So I could spend time, I don't actually even know what all of these are, but I could spend a while and go through and break it down. You know, logs is pretty clear. Logs are a development tool. If something goes wrong, a log file appears. You don't want that kind of thing in GitHub. That's more of a personal thing that you could see what's going wrong. Runtime data, I don't necessarily want to open up that box. And to be honest, I could probably learn a lot more about runtime data myself. Grunt files, this is like if we have essentially build scripts that we're creating ourselves. We definitely don't want the node modules because they're gigantic, and the whole point of NPM is that we don't have to send them around. And we already know why env. Yes, and you're absolutely right that the devlogs would create a vulnerability as well. Would an API key be considered secret? Yeah, yes, that's exactly the kind of thing. So for example, for those of you who don't know what an API key is, let's say you were using a third-party API as thrown out, you know, maybe Zillow, Google Maps, whatever. So they will provide you with a key that lets you access their API specifically, and it creates a secure, essentially a secure channel between your app and their API. So that's the sort of thing that you would not want, you would want in a .env file. So a lot of the times what happens is there's kind of a mock env file that does get pushed up that might have, you know, port, API key, you know, whatever else, all undefined, hash key, all these things undefined. And then you would, in some secure way, when you first get the copy of the repository as a teammate, someone in your team would get those to you in a more secure way and you'd fill them in on your local copy. So I've had that question before. All right, did that answer, do you have any more specific questions about the get ignore or about any of this? So back to the break issue. I will actually give you guys, where do I get the pre-made get ignore? I think this one comes from, there are different ways to do it, but I think this one actually comes from GitHub. So if you create your repository in GitHub, let me just show you. So if you go new repository, you can, there's an add get ignore, and you can actually go down and say node, and it will pre-generate you a node specific get ignore. So that's the way I've done it before. I think there are a few other approaches to it. I bet if you Googled it, you could find some other ways to do it. Oh, there's an npx get ignore. Cool, so it sounds like there's a library called get ignore that will generate one too. Still getting undefined for process.env.port. So there are three things that need to happen. The first is that your env file has port equals 5000. The next thing you need is at the top of index.js, you need this line of code. And then the final thing is you need to actually kill your server. So do a Control-C or Command-C and restart it. The reason that Nodamon won't auto restart for you is because it doesn't recognize .env because it's ignored. So make sure you save that file, kill, and then restart. And yes, you do need to install the library. But at that point, if you had this line and you didn't have the library installed, this would be crashing anyways. So my guess is it's not that. Did all three. And you're getting process, interesting. Undefined for process.env.port. Yeah, I would say send us a screenshot of your index.js. While we're waiting for that, so one other note. Oh wait, there it is. Process.env looks good on that file. Well, will you send us your .env file? Or maybe we should just actually, maybe we should just do a screen share. Let's send us a screenshot of the file if that's, got it. So this file needs to be called just .env, not process.env. So the file is .env and process.env is the object. Cool. I think we got that one worked out. So another little note, which I maybe should have mentioned at the beginning, but I kind of forgot this for a second myself, as you will see. So we are going to be using GitHub in order to deploy, which means that it's really important that you actually have your own forked copy of this. So if you cloned down from the from the Lambda version, that's kind of not good. And in fact, I actually cloned down from the Lambda version. So I will be setting up the workaround for that. Does anyone else want to see the workaround? You know, I can just do it quickly on my own, or I can actually explain it, which is essentially I'm going to set up a remote on my own and push to that. Because you will have to have a copy of this on your own GitHub to get it to work. All right, so let's go over the workaround for that. So we'll do, let's start out with guided and fork. Cool. So, oh wait, I have an old copy of it. I slacked. I didn't delete that. All right, give me a second, you guys. Let's delete the old version. My GitHub is basically a graveyard of projects that I created when I was in programming school like 4 years ago. All right, let's delete this. Cool. Cool. All right, then we will go back to so you guys don't have to do this step because presumably you don't have an old forked version from last time you taught this because I taught it. All right, so I'm forking it. Okay, so the first step, if you forgot to, yep, so if you forked it, you're fine. But if you forgot to fork it, this is the process for fixing it. So the first thing we do is we actually fork it. And then we, actually, you know what? We're not going to push it yet. So all you guys should have a forked copy of this, but we will go over this later because I want to show you what happens if we try to deploy it as is. All right, let me see how we panned out in this poll. I think people decided we don't want to take a break. So we're just going to keep plugging along. So the next step would be, let's actually, we all have a copy of it on our own personal GitHubs. Let's move over to Heroku. So at this point, you should all have your environment variable set. You should have your environment variable set up for port. You should have start script set up in package.json, and you should have a copy of this forked to your own personal GitHub. At this point, you're ready to jump on into Heroku. So I'll give you guys just a second here to pull up Heroku, sign in. You should see this page, unless you already have some apps created, in which case I think the button's in the corner, but either way, there's a create new app button somewhere. All right, I'm putting out a poll because I want to make sure that we're all here before we start. I have no idea if Heroku was always Salesforce or not. All right, so let me know if you guys are ready to start this process. I think that this should be the default page if you have no apps deployed. If you do, there might be a list of apps, and I think this button is in the corner. Or just stylistically. That's weird. I don't know why that is. All right, I see no no's. If anyone is still logging in, please vote no now or we're going to move along. All right, I think we're all there. So create new app. So we all have to come up with app names. Don't use the one I'm using or else I won't be able to use it. So we can call deploy WebPT6. So come up with some sort of unique name. So the next thing we want to look at is the deployment method. So there is a Heroku client, a Heroku command line interface that's really nice. And honestly, in the longer term method, I would recommend using this, and probably on projects, you'll want to use this. And when you get into more advanced database stuff, this is a good way to go. But for what we're doing today, we're going to use the GitHub deployment method, which is a really good way to just get off the ground. So the first thing we have to do is connect to our GitHub. My GitHub is already connected to, so life is easy for me, but I'll give you guys an extra moment to log in, get your credentials in, and find your repo. And then find the project and connect. So let me give you guys a minute to do that. All right, once that is done, we want to enable automatic deploys. So what that means is that every time you push a new version to GitHub, Heroku will update it. So press enable automatic deploys. And then the final step is we're going to press deploy branch. So before I do that, let me make sure you guys are all caught up. You should have selected GitHub as your deployment method, logged in with your credentials here, and then found the Web API 4 guided project, connected it, enabled automatic deploys, and then this manual deploy will just initially deploy what's already in our master branch there. If you created a branch to work off of, yeah, select that one. Though if you haven't pushed it, you might find that the branch isn't there. All right, I'm going to deploy. And we get to see this cool little build log here. All right, app was successfully deployed. So let's click on view. And it's spinning, and ooh, it crashed. So I know this is working for some of you guys, but I bet for some of you, you got the same thing I did. And I'm sure some of you have also figured out why. But I wanted to show it to you this way so that we could explore what to do when deployment doesn't work. So yeah, we could go to our application and scour it and try and figure out what in the world's going on. This information it says about checking the log gives us info on how to do it from the command line, but let's do it the old-fashioned way. And by the way, if you want to get to the logs, all you have to do is go to, oh wait, that's not what I wanted to do. All you have to do is go to the page in here, and there's in more something called view logs. So if you ever want to see your logs, that's how you get there. Yeah, I guess you're right that the old-fashioned way would be the command line. Oh well. All right. So let's, oh no, wait, this is just telling me how to view the logs. That's not useful. All right, I'm going to view logs here. Yep, and as some of you guys have seen, error missing script start. So this can be confusing, right? Because there's the start script. We all put it in together. Now, this is where we have to think about what is this actually reading? So this is reading not the code from our local machine, but the code from our repository. So when you're trying to figure out what's going wrong, don't look at the code on your machine because it might not be the right code. As it is right now, this is the version on my GitHub. I haven't pushed anything up there, so this is the version on my GitHub, and there is no start script here. So I need to take this and push it up to my GitHub. So I'm going to, and because I cloned it from Lambda, I have to set up a remote in order to do this. So this extra step is just something that I have to do because I messed up where I cloned it from. The rest of you guys who actually forked it properly can ignore what I'm about to do if you want to. But as some of you have said, this might be just a good thing to know in general. So the first thing I want to do is set up a remote, which is essentially a different repo that it's looking at. So I can go get add remote. What is, I always forget the exact. Let me Google this so I make sure I have the exact right word. So add remote get. I always forget this command. You can see it's already been clicked. So it's just get remote add name location. So get remote add, and we'll call this, I'll just call it my username, and then there it is. Yeah, get in the habit of forking things. Forking things is a good habits. Bad habits for Diandra, because I'm used to kind of just getting rid of these and not pushing them because I do this every couple months. But don't be like me. Be like Tara, who always forks. All right, so we've added a remote. And then instead of doing, we have to get status, get add, get commit, configured for deployment. And then instead of doing git push origin master, origin is the name of, origin is pointing towards that repository on Lambda School. So we can just swap this out for git push, whatever you named your remote, master. And if I wanted to, I could actually just repoint where origin is. But so there's a little bonus of some remote stuff that we got to learn because I forgot to fork. All right, so is everyone, let me put out a poll on this. If everyone is at this point where the most recent version is on their GitHub. And really the way you should check is you should actually go to your GitHub, refresh it, and take a look. So if I go into package.json, I see that the start script is there. That's a good sign. So does everyone have the latest version on their GitHub? Just about to put out that poll. All right. If you don't, we should pause and let you get a chance to. So what's really cool is that because we've set up continuous deployment, just the act of me pushing this meant that it redeployed. So for those of you who are voting no, some of you might just need a little more time, which I will give you. If you are stuck, especially if you're stuck on this remote issue, please ask in Slack and I'll help you out. when you click deploy, should the page show up blank? So you shouldn't have to, at this point, click deploy, or do you mean this tab? At this point, you shouldn't have to click deploy, but if you're talking about what should my site actually look like, it should have a array. There we go. So the root endpoint is a GET request. If we go back over here, we see that in server.js, the root endpoint is actually a GET request to where we find all shoutouts, which currently there are no shoutouts, so it should be empty. So I think a lot of us are deployed, which means we can start to have fun. So you guys know how this works. You guys can see what my URL is here. Your task, I'll give you a minute, is to populate my array. All right, hopefully there's some stuff in here. Nothing. So I'll give you a hint in case you got, maybe it's just taking a minute. How do I populate your array? I kind of want you to figure out, but I'll give you a hint, which is there is a post endpoint set up here. So you guys are going to have to make a post request to my API. Everyone's waiting for Postman to start up. So it's not hacking because it's a public API. Right now, this is a public API that anyone can access from anywhere. So this is a little different from what you guys have done with Postman, but it's pretty similar. Oh, you might be wondering what the data is supposed to look like in here. These shout outs, let me check that. There's a message. So that is a sticking point. So know that the type of object that we're expecting for these shout outs has a message. It's an object with a message key in it. There we go. Nice. So if anyone else wants to share their URL in Slack, we can start to send the link. Yeah, sure. So people, if you guys want to start sending your app links in Slack, we can populate each other's. There's a question about the get add remote. So it's get remote, add remote name. So you can put whatever you want to call your remote right there, and then URL. So this should be the name and then the GitHub URL. I'll post that in Slack as well. If any of you guys are still confused about how we're populating these, I will pick on, let's pick on Kale because he's the last person to post in Slack. So we can go over into Postman, do a post request to this URL, and then message and we get back ID 3. And if we even check out his app in the browser, we see a few different people have posted there. So that's pretty cool because we can now send stuff to each other instead of just on our own local machines. Successful deployment. Oh, wow. I shouldn't tell you guys this because it'll give you ideas, but the last time I taught this class, someone posted some really creepy, like all these symbols, and it looked like cultists had gotten into my API. That was pretty jarring, but don't get any ideas. This 1 million hey Diandra messages is pretty good. I like this better than the culty stuff from last time. All right, so let's, uh-oh, too late, culty stuff coming in. Okay, so this is the gist of it. I want to pause for a minute and make sure if anyone's stuck and hasn't gotten their app deployed, let's work through it. If anyone has any questions on what we've done so far, feel free to ask now. All right, if you're getting an error, what you should do is go into Heroku, go to your view the logs, and see what's actually gone wrong here. That's cool. We can actually see error messages appearing here for some of you. Yep, it looks like someone just tried to post something that had it was missing a message, and it actually rejected it and even logged the error. But yeah, so if you're having a problem, see if you can figure out what's going on here. If you're still stuck in a few minutes, let me know and we'll work on it. All right, I'm gonna start to move on to our next topic for tonight, but as I said, if some of you guys haven't successfully deployed and are still struggling with something, we can come back to that and help you debug if you can't figure it out. So I wanna do one more thing with environment variables. So let's jump on over to server.js. And I want to make a little change here. So in my shout-out logic, in this get request to the root, I want to define a variable called message of message of the day. What should our default message of the day be? Any suggestions? Something having to do with Pikachu, perhaps? All right, that's a good one. And it's catch 'em all, not them. Ooh, I also really like don't forget the homies, but I already typed this one in. So that's gonna be our default, but we wanna check our environment to see if there is a message of the day. So within our, what is going on here? I don't know why it's getting mad at me. Okay, so within our process.env, we're expecting there to potentially be this MOTD, message of the day variable. And if it's defined, that will be our message of the day. Otherwise, it's just gonna default to catch 'em all. And then what we'll do is we'll actually send that message out along with the master list of shoutouts. So all I've done here is change the response so it's going to send a message as well as shoutouts. So right now we have every reason to believe it's just going to be catch 'em all. We haven't defined any sort of message of the day locally, and there's no reason to think that Heroku will be defining this for us. So let's go ahead and, as a little reminder, if we just refresh our app, where did my app go? If we just refresh our app, there's going to be no message of the day, right? Because we haven't pushed this yet. So we have to actually do the GitHub thing. And git push master. So it'll take just a second to redeploy. See if it's back up. Not yet. And look, we can actually see what port it's running on because we dynamically define that port. We can see which port was chosen for us by Heroku. So it's looking good. And we've actually reset the database. This is, I kind of mentioned briefly that we're using a easy type of database, but the bad side is that whenever we redeploy, the database completely resets, which is not how we would want things to be done if it were a real production app. But our message of the day is coming through. All right, so if we wanted to change this message of the day, I mean, we could, of course, hard code something new into our app, save it, and redeploy it. But a simpler way to do it would be to actually change an environment variable or set an environment variable on Heroku. So this is the last thing I want to show you. So Heroku will automatically define port because it needs to even deploy. But if we want to set up other production environment variables, things like secret keys or API keys that someone brought up earlier, we can do that. And the way we do that is we go into settings. So over here, we're on our app, we go into settings, and there's this config variable thing. So we could go in and say MOTD and maybe save it, change it to don't forget the homies. Right, nice. Don't think we have to redeploy. Should just refresh this. I don't think we need the quotes. My bad. No quotes necessary. It understands that this is a string already. So save changes. And then it does refresh our database, but it updates. So if we wanted to set up config variables, that's how we would do it in Heroku. So the last thing I want you guys to do is I'm going to give you just 2 minutes. Well, let me let you catch up on all this first. Let's make sure everyone's caught up. I'm going to put a poll out. And once again, if you just need a little more time, just vote no. But if you're stuck on something, please let me know and we will work through it together. All right, looks like a handful of you need more time. So I'm gonna just kind of halt while you all catch up and trust that you will ask if you need help with anything particular. So we've got this variable set up in Heroku, and then this is what it looks like in the actual code base. Kind of trying to share the screen here. Okay, the question of how am I redeploying? So because we set up continuous deployment, every time I push up to my repository, it automatically redeploys. If you want to manually deploy, you can just go to this deploy page and at the bottom, deploy branch, and that will trigger one. We have not done anything in .env file with message of the day. You've reached your max deploys. That's not good. All right, sounds like you're still getting web process failed to bind port. Can you send us what your index.js file looks like on GitHub? So don't send the one that's on your machine, but the one that's actually on your GitHub. Yep, so Justin, all you need to do is make sure that you actually take the port variable and put it in server.listen. And if anyone else is having that same issue, it might be that you define this, but then still had this one hard-coded in. So this is the actual place that it really matters. Looking back at that poll, a couple people still need more time. So just remember when you're all caught up to change your vote to yes. If you're only seeing the empty array, it's just because it's deployed correctly. It's just because no one has added anything to your API. So Melvin, if you want, you can post your URL in Slack right now, and I bet some of us can add some fun stuff in there. I will even do that while we're waiting. You should be seeing a message. Oh, wait, actually, yeah, you should be seeing a message of the day in there if you've updated that. So if this has been changed and pushed up to GitHub, it might take a second for it to redeploy, but you should be seeing both message of the day and the empty array. So let's see what's going on with that one. Yeah, no message of the day in there. So I can only figure that this object that's being sent back has not been updated. Or it just hasn't fully redeployed yet. If you go to your logs, you can see what it's up to. If you had messages in your shoutouts and then they became empty, it's because of the way we've set up our database, every time it redeploys, it's going to reset. Still no message of the day, but looking good. All right, I think you guys are ready for a short task. So my task for you should only take about a minute or two. Set it up so that instead of having a default value here, we're actually defining the MOTD variable. Well, we should have a default, but set this up so that there's a different message of the day defined for the development branch. Let me say that again. Change your code base so that there is a MOTD variable being defined for the development branch. So you have process.env.motd should be defined in development. Let me give you guys 2 minutes to work on that. All right, have fun. All right, so this one's really easy. All we have to do is go into env and define message of the day equals I can't remember if we have to put this in quotes or not. I think we do. So hello world. Now keep in mind this is only in development, so let's make sure this is still running on port 5000. And if we do a GET request to localhost 5000, we see that the message of the world, or the message of the day is hello world, which is coming from process.env. So once we have that first setup step, we can just kind of indefinitely add new variables into this file. Well, that is all we've got for today. I know that this lecture, I really like this lecture because, as I said before, it allows us to go through and kind of go over some of the configuration stuff with a fine-tooth comb and make sure we really understand what's going on. but it also can be a little bit of a chaotic lecture because different people are having different issues and we're all debugging together. So before we call it quits, I want to make sure that everyone's good, everyone's caught up, no one's having a mysterious deployment error. So please, if you are, speak up now, or if you would prefer to private message me, you're welcome to do that as well. But in the meantime, let me tell you about the challenge for tonight. So the challenge for tonight is pretty simple. I'll post the link there, but you don't even really need this repo for anything but instructions. So pick an API, one of your past projects, anything we've worked on so far in the last 2 weeks, and deploy it to Heroku. So in this case, it should be a slightly more sophisticated API because we've been working with full CRUD operations, but you'll still have to go through all the same setup steps. So find a past project, deploy it deploy it using Heroku, and then send the link to your team lead. That's all. Any questions or issues before we call it quits for today? I would encourage you to use one of your projects from backend. So if you want to, go ahead and play with something from React, but pick something that actually has an API. So pick something from backend to deploy. Yeah, you can pick a guided project or a homework challenge. Waiting for the guy with the lead pipe. Things I will tell you, the pace will pick up next week with database. And actually on that note, I'll remind you again next week, but yeah, the pace for databases is definitely going to pick up. So hopefully you're already doing this, but it's going to become really critical that you're watching those pre-class videos because we'll be moving a lot faster starting next week. All right, that is all for our deployment lecture. As mentioned, with this deployment stuff, sometimes just one little thing doesn't jive, and next thing you know, you're spending 2 hours and you're not getting anywhere. And if you're stuck on something like that, please reach out. There's no reason to just be hitting your head against the wall. So whether you're reaching out to each other or to your team leads or even to me, if you're really stuck, please reach out if you get stuck on something with this deployment stuff. Because once you get the hang of it, it becomes pretty easy, but it can be extremely frustrating at the beginning if something's just not quite right. So that is all for our first sprint. I will be posting a poll right after this lecture for a Q&A this weekend. And otherwise, I will see you guys on Tuesday for the first database lecture. Have a great night and have fun deploying. Share your links with each other.